Facing dozens of customers in a fancy cafe in downtown Seattle, Callen Brooks stood frozen as the sharp sound of a slap echoed through the room. Conversations died instantly. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. Every eye turned toward the exhausted man in the worn denim jacket, whose face had just been struck by one of the most powerful women in the city, Victoria Harrington. Billionaire CEO of Harrington Dynamics stood over him with cold fury blazing in her eyes. To everyone watching the scene seemed simple. A careless, poor-looking man had ruined her expensive designer suit and now faced the consequences. Nobody noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes. Nobody knew he had spent the entire night beside his 8-year-old daughter's hospital bed. Nobody knew that his bank account contained less than $50, that an eviction notice waited on his kitchen table, or that he had skipped meals for days to make sure his little girl could eat. They saw only a struggling single father and judged him before he could speak a single word. As whispers spread through the cafe and humiliation tightened around him like a noose, Callen did something unexpected. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even defend himself. Instead, he quietly bent down to gather the papers that had fallen from his hands. Resumes, job applications, rejection letters. The scattered remains of a man desperately trying to rebuild a life that had already broken him once. Then he looked up and said something so calm, so heartbreakingly sincere, that even a few strangers felt a sting of guilt. "I hope you never have to experience the kind of days I've been living." But Victoria was too angry to hear the pain behind those words. She turned away, convinced she had dealt with another insignificant inconvenience in her busy life. And that should have been the end of it. Yet fate had other plans. Standing only a few feet away, her head of security, Marcus Reed suddenly noticed something as Callen rolled down his sleeve. A scar. Long. Jagged. Faded by time, but impossible to forget. Marcus's heart nearly stopped. His eyes widened in disbelief as memories he had buried for more than a decade came crashing back. The freezing river, the sinking school bus, the terrified children, the desperate fight for survival, and the unknown hero who had risked everything to save lives before disappearing without asking for recognition money or gratitude. Marcus remembered that scar. He would never forget it. The room remained silent as the bodyguard slowly stepped forward, staring at the poor single father as if he had seen a ghost. What happened next would shock everyone in that cafe. Within minutes, a hidden truth would be revealed. A powerful CEO would be forced to confront the person she had become, and a broken father carrying unimaginable sacrifices would finally be seen for who he truly was. Because the man Victoria Harrington had just humiliated was not a failure. He was not a nobody. He was a hero. And the scar on his wrist was about to change all of their lives forever. The alarm on Callen Brooks's battered phone began vibrating at 4:30 in the morning, long before the first hint of sunlight touched the Seattle skyline. He opened his eyes instantly. Years of responsibility had trained him to wake up before the alarm ever had the chance to ring. For a few seconds, he lay motionless on the worn couch that had become his bed after selling most of the furniture in the apartment. The ceiling above him was stained with watermarks from an old leak the landlord never bothered to repair. The room was cold. The heater had been broken for weeks, and Callen had quietly decided that paying for Lily's medication mattered more than fixing it. He rubbed his tired face and slowly sat up, feeling the familiar ache in his back. Every muscle in his body seemed heavier than it had the day before. 38 wasn't old, but grief exhaustion and constant worry had aged him far beyond his years. Across the tiny apartment, a small bedroom door stood slightly open. Through the gap, he could see his daughter sleeping peacefully beneath a faded pink blanket. Lily Brooks was 8 years old, with chestnut hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that somehow still carried light into the darkest corners of his life. She was also the reason he refused to give up. Callen quietly walked to her room and stood in the doorway for a moment. Every morning, he checked her breathing before anything else. It had become a habit ever since doctors diagnosed her congenital heart condition years ago. Most children slept without their parents, worrying whether each breath would lead to the next. Callen never had that luxury. He watched her chest rise and fall, feeling a small wave of relief wash over him. Another night survived, another morning together. In his world, that counted as a victory. He moved silently into the kitchen, if the cramped corner of the apartment could even be called a kitchen. Opening the refrigerator revealed little more than milk eggs and a few slices of bread. Payday was still days away, assuming he could find enough work to earn one. He carefully prepared breakfast, making sure Lily would have the larger portion. While the eggs cooked, he opened a stack of envelopes sitting on the counter. Most people dreaded bills. For Callen, bills felt like enemies waiting patiently at the door. The first envelope came from the hospital. His stomach tightened before he even unfolded it. Another payment reminder. Another warning about overdue balances. Another notice explaining that continued treatment required financial arrangements. The numbers blurred together as he stared at them. Thousands of dollars. More than he could possibly afford. More than he had ever imagined owing. Yet none of that mattered compared to the simple truth that Lily needed care. If he had to work 20 jobs, he would. If he had to sleep in his car, he would. Nothing was more important than keeping his daughter healthy. He slid the bill back into the envelope before Lily could see it. She already carried enough worries for a child her age. A few minutes later, small footsteps padded across the floor. Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, Dad," she said with a sleepy smile. Instantly, the weight on Callen's shoulders felt lighter. "Morning, sweetheart." She climbed onto a chair and smiled at the breakfast waiting for her. "You made eggs again. Your favorite. They're your favorite, too. Maybe that's why I keep making them." She giggled. Moments like this kept him alive. They were tiny, ordinary moments, but they meant everything. During breakfast, Lily talked about school projects, her friends, and a field trip coming up later that month. Callen listened carefully, smiling whenever she smiled. Then came the question he had secretly feared. "Dad, yeah, the field trip payment is due next week." The smile froze on his face. Lily noticed immediately. She always noticed. "It's okay," she said quickly. "I don't really need to go." Callen's heart broke. Children should never learn how to hide disappointment so young. "Of course you're going," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out." Lily looked unconvinced. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep, but he made it anyway. Because fathers did that. Fathers carried impossible promises and somehow found ways to honor them. After walking Lily to school, Callen spent the rest of the morning searching for work. His old pickup truck rattled and groaned as it moved through city traffic. The vehicle was nearly 20 years old and barely running, but replacing it was impossible. Every dollar had a destination before he earned it. Rent, utilities, medical bills, medication, food. There was never enough left over for anything else. He stopped at construction sites, warehouses, repair shops, and delivery companies. Some managers politely accepted his resume. Others barely looked up before rejecting him. The economy had become harder. Companies were cutting costs. Hundreds of applicants competed for every opening. By noon, Callen had heard the word no so many times that it no longer surprised him. Rejection had become another part of his routine. At a warehouse near the industrial district, a supervisor finally offered him a temporary position unloading trucks. The pay was low. The hours were uncertain. The work was physically demanding. Callen accepted immediately. He could not afford pride. For the next several hours, he lifted heavy crates until sweat soaked through his shirt. His hands grew sore. His back screamed in protest. Yet he kept working. Every box represented medicine. Every pallet represented rent. Every aching muscle represented another day his daughter could stay safe. During a short break, his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed the hospital's name. Fear instantly settled into his chest. He answered before the second ring. "Mr. Brooks," a nurse asked. "Yes. We need to discuss Lily's latest test results." Callen stepped away from the noise of the warehouse. His heart pounded. The nurse explained that Lily's condition remained stable, but further monitoring would be necessary. There were additional tests recommended by her specialist. Additional tests meant additional expenses, more appointments, more bills, more impossible decisions. When the call ended, Callen leaned against a wall and closed his eyes. For a moment, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. 7 years earlier, his wife Emma would have been there beside him. Emma had always known how to carry hope into difficult situations. She could make him believe things would be okay, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. Then one rainy evening, a drunk driver had taken her away forever. Callen still remembered the hospital hallway, the doctor's expression, the crushing silence that followed. One moment he had been a husband planning a future. The next, he was a widowed father holding a terrified little girl who kept asking when her mother would wake up. Losing Emma had shattered him. But becoming Lily's only parent had forced him to keep moving forward. There had been nights when grief felt unbearable, nights when loneliness sat beside him like a shadow, nights when he cried after Lily fell asleep because he couldn't let her see him breaking apart. Yet every morning he stood up again. Every morning he chose to continue. Not because he was strong, because Lily needed him. When his shift ended, the supervisor handed him a small payment envelope. The amount inside barely covered groceries. Even so, Callen thanked him sincerely. On the drive home, he stopped at a pharmacy to refill Lily's prescription. The total cost consumed most of what he had earned that day. He stared at the receipt afterward, calculating numbers in his head. Rent was due soon. Utilities were overdue. The hospital continued calling. His savings account had already disappeared months ago. The life insurance settlement from Emma's death was long gone. One emergency away from disaster. One unexpected expense away from homelessness. Yet somehow he kept smiling whenever Lily looked at him. That evening he found her sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures. "Look, Dad," she said excitedly. She held up a colorful drawing of 3 people holding hands beneath a bright sun. Callen immediately recognized the figures. Him, Lily, Emma. His throat tightened. "It's beautiful. Mom's in heaven," Lily said softly. "But she's still with us, right?" Callen knelt beside her. "Every day." Lily nodded and smiled. Children had a remarkable ability to find light where adults saw only darkness. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Callen sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Spread before him were unpaid bills, job applications, and a notebook filled with calculations. He spent hours moving numbers around, searching for solutions that didn't exist. The final total remained the same. He simply didn't have enough money. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Callen stared into the darkness beyond the glass and allowed himself one brief moment of weakness. He wondered how much longer he could keep fighting. He wondered whether he was failing his daughter despite giving everything he had. He wondered what Emma would tell him if she were still here. Then he looked toward Lily's bedroom. Through the partially opened door, he could see her sleeping peacefully. That single glimpse gave him all the answer he needed. Tomorrow he would wake up before sunrise again. Tomorrow he would search for more work again. Tomorrow he would keep fighting again, because quitting was not an option. Not while his daughter still needed him. Not while there was even the smallest chance of building a better future for her. Callen Brooks had lost his wife. He had lost his career. He had lost financial security and nearly every comfort he once knew. But there was one thing he refused to lose: hope. No matter how many doors closed, no matter how many debts piled higher, no matter how heavy the burden became, he would continue moving forward one step at a time. He had no idea that fate was already preparing to change his life forever. He did not know that within days, A simple visit to a cafe would place him directly in the path of one of the most powerful women in America. He did not know that humiliation, revelation, and redemption were waiting just around the corner. For now, he was simply a father sitting alone in a dim apartment praying that tomorrow would somehow be better than today. 3 days later, Seattle woke beneath a curtain of relentless rain. Gray clouds hung low over the city, turning the morning into something that felt more like dusk. Callen Brooks sat behind the wheel of his aging pickup truck, staring at the last $23 in his wallet. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. His rent was overdue. The hospital bill remained unpaid. And earlier that morning, he had received another email informing him that a job opportunity he had desperately hoped for had gone to another candidate. For a few moments, he simply sat there listening to the rain strike the windshield. Most people experienced bad days occasionally. For Callen, bad days had become so common that they felt normal. Yet despite everything, he forced himself to start the engine. Lily needed him. That simple truth carried him through every disappointment. His destination was a corporate office downtown where a logistics company was conducting walk-in interviews. It wasn't his dream job. At this point, he no longer cared about dreams. He cared about survival. He cared about keeping the lights on and making sure his daughter had a future. The interview was scheduled for noon. Unfortunately, Seattle traffic and heavy rain transformed a 30-minute drive into a frustrating ordeal. By the time Callen reached downtown, he was already soaked from running between parking areas and office buildings. Worse still, he discovered the company had canceled the interviews due to restructuring. No warning, no apology, just another closed door. Standing outside the building with rain dripping from his jacket, Callen felt something inside him sink a little further. He checked his phone. A message from Lily's school reminded parents that the field trip payment deadline was approaching. Another message from the landlord requested immediate payment. Then a voicemail notification from the hospital appeared. Callen closed his eyes briefly. Sometimes it felt as though life had formed a line simply to take turns hitting him. Across the street stood an upscale cafe. Through the large windows, he could see warm lighting, comfortable chairs, and people enjoying expensive drinks while escaping the weather. He wasn't planning to spend money he couldn't spare, but he needed somewhere dry to sit while he reviewed job listings and returned a few calls. After a moment of hesitation, he crossed the street and entered. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries immediately filled the air. It was the kind of place where successful professionals conducted business meetings and wealthy executives discussed investments. The polished floors gleamed. Soft music played in the background. Most customers wore tailored suits and expensive watches. Callen instantly felt out of place in his faded denim jacket and worn work boots. Still, nobody stopped him from entering. He ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and found a small table near the back. Pulling out a folder filled with resumes and applications, he began reviewing notes for future interviews. For nearly 20 minutes, everything remained peaceful. Then the atmosphere changed. The front doors opened and several people entered at once. Conversations throughout the cafe began to quiet. Heads turned. Employees suddenly moved with greater urgency. Even customers seemed to recognize the arrival of someone important. Victoria Harrington had entered the building. As CEO of Harrington Dynamics, she was one of the most recognizable business leaders in the Pacific Northwest. Magazine covers featured her regularly. Financial news channels frequently discussed her decisions. At 35 years old, she had built a reputation as a brilliant strategist who transformed struggling companies into billion-dollar successes. She was admired, feared, respected, and envied. Dressed in an elegant, cream-colored designer suit, Victoria moved through the cafe with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding every room she entered. Behind her walked assistants, advisors, and security personnel. Among them was Marcus Reed, her longtime head of security. The manager personally greeted Victoria and escorted her to a reserved seating area near the center of the cafe. Staff members hurried to ensure every detail met expectations. Callen barely noticed. He had bigger concerns than celebrity CEOs. His attention remained focused on his paperwork and his phone. A few minutes later, the hospital finally returned his call. His heart immediately tightened. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Brooks," the specialist's office asked. "Yes. We're calling regarding Lily's upcoming cardiac evaluation." Callen stood and moved away from nearby customers so he could hear more clearly. The doctor explained that additional testing would be necessary sooner than expected. The words hit him like a punch. Additional testing meant additional expenses. The specialist gently outlined the estimated costs. By the end of the conversation, Callen felt physically ill. He thanked the caller and ended the call. For several seconds, he simply stood there trying to process everything. How was he supposed to afford more treatment? How many jobs would it take? How many more sacrifices lost in thought? He failed to notice a young server hurrying through the crowded cafe carrying a tray loaded with drinks. At the exact moment Callen turned, the employee slipped slightly on the polished floor. The tray tilted. A large cup of hot coffee flew forward. Everything happened in less than a second. The drink splashed directly across Victoria Harrington's designer jacket. Gasps erupted throughout the cafe. Silence followed almost instantly. The server froze in horror. Victoria looked down at the dark stains spreading across the expensive fabric. Then her eyes slowly lifted toward Callen. Unfortunately, from her perspective, it appeared as though he had bumped into the employee and caused the accident. Before anyone could explain what had actually happened, Victoria's expression hardened. "Are you serious?" she snapped. The entire cafe turned toward them. Callen blinked in confusion. "Excuse me? Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Victoria demanded. You weren't watching where you were going." The young server looked terrified. She opened her mouth as if intending to explain, but one look at Victoria's face caused her to remain silent. Nobody wanted to challenge one of the most powerful women in the city. Callen glanced at the frightened employee and immediately understood what was happening. The girl feared losing her job. "Actually," he said calmly, "it wasn't her fault." Victoria laughed bitterly. "So now you're defending her while pretending you had nothing to do with it." Several customers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Some suspected there was more to the story, but nobody spoke up. Wealth and influence have a way of silencing people. Victoria stepped closer. "Do you know how much this suit costs?" Callen honestly didn't care. "Ma'am, it was an accident." "An accident caused by carelessness." Her voice grew louder. "People who don't respect their surroundings create problems for everyone else." Callen felt dozens of eyes fixed on him. Embarrassment crept into his chest. He wanted to leave. He wanted to avoid confrontation. Yet he also refused to accept blame for something he hadn't done. "I understand you're upset," he said carefully, "but I didn't cause this." Victoria glanced at his clothing. Her gaze traveled from his worn boots to his faded jacket and weathered resume folder. Something judgmental entered her expression. "Of course you didn't." The sarcasm was unmistakable. "Let me guess. Nothing is ever your fault." A few uncomfortable chuckles emerged from nearby tables. Callen felt heat rising into his face, not because he was angry, because he recognized the look she was giving him. He had seen it before. The look people reserved for those they considered failures. People who judged poverty as a character flaw. People who assumed struggling individuals deserved their circumstances. Victoria folded her arms. "You come into places like this looking like that and expect everyone else to clean up your mistakes." The words cut deeper than she realized. Callen had spent years sacrificing everything for his daughter, years swallowing pride, years working himself to exhaustion, yet in her eyes he was simply another irresponsible man causing trouble. The server finally found the courage to speak. "Miss Harrington actually—" Victoria raised a hand without looking at her. "Not now." The young woman immediately fell silent. Callen noticed tears forming in the employee's eyes. He hated injustice, especially when directed at someone who couldn't defend themselves. "Please stop blaming her," he said firmly. "She's not responsible." Victoria stared at him. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" The room became even quieter. Tension hung heavily in the air. Marcus Reed watched everything from several feet away. Unlike the others, he paid close attention to details. He noticed the trembling server. He noticed Callen's calm demeanor. Most importantly, he noticed that the man never once raised his voice despite being publicly humiliated. Victoria, however, remained consumed by anger. "People spend years building successful lives," she said sharply. "Then someone careless walks in and damages what they've worked for." Callen almost laughed at the irony. If only she knew how much he had lost. If only she knew how many dreams had already been taken from him. "I know something about losing things," he replied quietly. Victoria interpreted the statement as defiance. "Really?" she asked coldly. "From where I'm standing, it looks like you've never learned responsibility." The insult struck like a slap long before the actual one arrived. Several customers looked away in discomfort. Even members of Victoria's own staff appeared uneasy. Yet nobody intervened. Callen slowly gathered his papers. He had endured enough humiliation for one day. "I'm sorry about your suit," he said, "but I won't apologize for something I didn't do." Victoria's eyes narrowed. The simple refusal challenged her authority in front of dozens of witnesses. Years of power had conditioned her to expect compliance. Instead, this exhausted stranger stood his ground with quiet dignity. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "You damage someone's property and then act like the victim." Callen looked directly at her. There was no anger in his expression, only sadness. "I hope you never experience the kind of struggles that teach you not to judge people so quickly." Something about those words should have made her pause. Instead, they fueled her frustration. In one reckless moment driven by pride, anger, and a desperate need to assert control, Victoria stepped forward and struck him across the face. The sound echoed throughout the cafe. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Callen's head turned slightly from the impact. A red mark immediately appeared on his cheek. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Time itself seemed to stop. The young server covered her mouth in shock. Several customers stared in disbelief. Even Victoria's own assistants looked horrified. Yet the most astonishing reaction came from Callen himself. He did nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He didn't threaten legal action. He simply bent down and picked up the resumes that had fallen from his hands. Then he looked at Victoria with calm, tired eyes and said quietly, "I truly hope life is kinder to you than it has been to me." Those words carried more power than any scream ever could. And somewhere in the cafe, Marcus Reed suddenly noticed something as Callen reached for the papers on the floor. The sleeve of his jacket slipped upward for a brief moment. A faded scar appeared across his wrist. Marcus froze. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened. Because he knew that scar. And what he remembered was about to change everything. The silence that followed Victoria Harrington's slap seemed to stretch endlessly across the cafe. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself felt heavy, as if every person in the room had suddenly become aware that something deeply wrong had just occurred. Callen Brooks remained calm despite the red mark forming on his cheek. He knelt down and gathered the papers scattered across the floor, carefully straightening each resume as though protecting something valuable. His composure only made the scene more painful to watch. Most people would have exploded with anger. Most people would have shouted, threatened, or demanded justice. But Callen simply picked up his belongings and prepared to leave. It was then that Marcus Reed saw the scar. The sleeve of Callen's jacket had slipped back just enough to expose the faded mark running across his wrist. Marcus's eyes locked onto it instantly. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion came first, then disbelief, then something much deeper. His breathing slowed. His heart began pounding. For a moment he forgot where he was. Forgotten memories burst through his mind with startling clarity. Cold water, screaming children, shattered glass, a river swollen by heavy spring rain. Marcus took an involuntary step forward. "No," he whispered. His voice was barely audible. Callen continued gathering his papers, unaware of the storm unfolding inside the bodyguard's mind. Marcus stared harder at the scar. The shape, the location, the angle. There was no mistake. He had seen that scar before, 10 years earlier, on the worst day of his life. "Wait," Marcus suddenly said. His voice was louder this time. Everyone turned toward him. Victoria frowned. "Marcus..." But the bodyguard wasn't looking at her. His eyes never left Callen. "Turn around." Callen slowly stood. Confusion appeared on his face. "Excuse me?" Marcus stepped closer. The cafe watched in silence. "That scar," Marcus said quietly. "How did you get it?" Callen looked down at his wrist. For a moment his expression changed. Not fear, not anxiety. Recognition. As though someone had just opened a door to a part of his life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "Long time ago," Callen replied. "An accident." Marcus swallowed hard. "What kind of accident?" Victoria crossed her arms impatiently. "Marcus, what is this about?" He ignored her completely. Every instinct told him he was standing in front of someone he had searched for over an entire decade. 10 years ago, Marcus continued, his voice trembling slightly, there was a school bus accident near Spokane River. The room grew even quieter. Callen's eyes narrowed slightly. Marcus saw it immediately. Recognition. "The bus crashed through a guardrail," Marcus continued. "It went into the water." A few people in the cafe exchanged looks. Some vaguely remembered hearing about the tragedy years earlier. It had dominated local news for days. There were children trapped inside. Marcus's voice became emotional. 11 of them. Callen remained silent. Victoria glanced between the two men, clearly confused. Marcus took another step forward. "I was there." His eyes glistened. "I was one of the responders." The memories now flooded through him completely. 10 years ago, Marcus had still been serving in emergency rescue operations. The river had been swollen from days of rain. The current had been violent. The school bus had plunged into deep water and begun sinking rapidly. Chaos had erupted everywhere. Parents screamed from the riverbank. Emergency crews rushed to the scene. Precious seconds disappeared. Marcus remembered diving into the freezing water. He remembered fighting the current. He remembered trying to reach the children. Then he remembered becoming trapped himself when part of the bus shifted unexpectedly beneath the surface. For one terrifying moment, he had believed he was going to die. "I couldn't get free," Marcus said. His voice cracked. "The metal pinned me down." Every person in the cafe listened in complete silence. Even Victoria appeared captivated now. "The current kept pushing me deeper." Marcus stared directly at Callen. "I remember running out of air." He paused. "And then someone grabbed me." Callen lowered his eyes. Marcus felt his chest tighten. A man came back. His voice shook visibly now. Not once, not twice. 3 separate times. The cafe remained frozen. "He rescued children first." Marcus swallowed. "Then he came back for me." Victoria slowly turned toward Callen. The color was beginning to drain from her face. Marcus continued. "The bus windows had shattered." He pointed toward the scar. "One of the broken pieces sliced through his wrist while he was pulling me free." His voice became barely more than a whisper. "That scar. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. I never forgot it." Callen closed his eyes briefly. A long sigh escaped him. The silence itself became an answer. Marcus felt tears forming. It was you, wasn't it? Callen said nothing at first. Then he looked up. A lot of people helped that day. Marcus shook his head immediately. No. His voice grew stronger. Most people couldn't reach the bus because of the current. He took another step forward. You were the one who kept going back. Callen's shoulders sagged slightly. Those kids needed help. The simple response shattered whatever doubt remained. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. For 10 years he had imagined this moment. For 10 years he had wondered about the stranger who had risked everything to save lives and then disappeared before anyone could properly thank him. Reporters searched for the hero afterward. Authorities searched. Families searched. Nobody ever found him. And now, after a decade, he was standing in a cafe being publicly humiliated by people who had no idea who he was. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. Before anyone could react, the large bodyguard did something nobody expected. He stepped forward and wrapped Callen in a tight embrace. Gasps echoed throughout the room. "You saved my life," Marcus whispered. "You saved all of us." Callen looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No." Marcus pulled back and shook his head. "Most people wouldn't." He looked around the cafe. "I was there. I saw it." His voice rose. "This man went into that river over and over again while everyone else was terrified to enter." Several customers stared at Callen with growing astonishment. Marcus continued. "He pulled children through broken windows. He carried them through freezing water. He nearly drowned. And after saving 11 lives, he vanished before the news crews even arrived." Shock spread across every face in the room. The server who had been blamed earlier covered her mouth. One customer actually began crying. Victoria stood completely motionless. Her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. The exhausted man she had mocked. The man whose clothes she had judged. The man she had slapped. He wasn't irresponsible. He wasn't careless. He wasn't a nobody. He was a hero, a real hero. Not the kind celebrated on magazine covers. Not the kind praised in corporate boardrooms. A genuine hero who had risked his life to save strangers without expecting anything in return. For the first time since entering the cafe, Victoria truly looked at him. She noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the worn edges of his jacket, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. She remembered every cruel assumption she had made, every insulting word she had spoken, every judgment she had delivered without knowing a single thing about his life. Shame hit her with devastating force. Marcus wasn't finished. "Do you know what happened afterward?" he asked the room. Nobody answered. He refused every interview, refused every reward, refused every public appearance. He looked at Callen. "Why?" Callen shrugged. "Because those kids surviving was enough." The simplicity of the answer broke something inside Victoria. In her world, people fought endlessly for recognition. They competed for praise status, headlines, promotions, and power. Yet this man had performed an extraordinary act of courage and asked for absolutely nothing. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Victoria felt her stomach twist. She remembered the look in Callen's eyes after she slapped him. Not hatred, not anger, sadness. He had pitied her. The realization was almost unbearable. Around the cafe, the emotional atmosphere shifted completely. Minutes earlier, people had viewed Callen as an inconvenience. Now they looked at him with admiration and respect. The anger they felt toward Victoria intensified. Several customers openly glared at her. Others shook their heads in disappointment. But Victoria barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the man standing before her. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely ashamed of herself. Callen glanced toward the exit. He clearly wanted to leave. He hated being the center of attention. Yet before he could take a single step, Marcus spoke again. "There's something else everyone should know." Callen's expression changed slightly. Marcus looked at him carefully. "After the accident, Your injuries cost you your rescue career, didn't they? A shadow passed across Callen's face. He didn't answer immediately. That silence revealed more than words ever could. Victoria felt her heart sink. The story was even deeper than she had imagined. And as she stared at the man she had publicly humiliated, a painful realization began taking shape inside her. The truth she had desperately needed to hear was finally standing right in front of her. And it was about to change her life forever. For several long seconds, Victoria Harrington stood completely still as the weight of her actions crashed down upon her. The powerful CEO who had spent years commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals suddenly felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Looking at Callen Brooks, she no longer saw a struggling man in worn clothing. She saw a father who had sacrificed everything for his child. She saw a widower carrying unimaginable grief. She saw a hero who had once risked his own life to save strangers and had never asked for anything in return. Most painfully of all, she saw the man she had publicly humiliated without knowing his story. With trembling hands, Victoria stepped forward. The entire cafe watched in silence. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I owe you an apology." Tears filled her eyes as she continued. "I judged you without knowing you. I insulted you. I blamed you for something you didn't do. And worst of all, I treated you with a cruelty you never deserved." The room remained silent as Victoria lowered her head. "I am deeply ashamed of myself." No cameras were present. No reporters were watching. This was not a performance. It was genuine remorse. Callen looked at her quietly. Years of hardship had taught him that anger often created more pain than healing. "We all make mistakes," he finally said. Victoria looked up in disbelief. "After everything I said," Callen gave a tired smile, "life has taught me that carrying bitterness only makes the burden heavier." His words struck her heart harder than any accusation ever could. A few weeks later, Victoria personally arranged for Lily Brooks to meet with some of the nation's best pediatric heart specialists. Every examination, treatment, and procedure was fully funded. For the first time in years, Callen heard doctors speak with confidence about Lily's future. The little girl who had spent so much of her childhood in hospitals finally had a real chance at a healthy life. But Victoria's transformation did not stop there. Determined to honor the lesson Callen had taught her, she established the Brooks Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping single parents facing financial hardship while caring for children with serious medical conditions. The foundation quickly helped hundreds of families who had once felt as alone as Callen had. 1 year later, Victoria, Marcus Callen, and Lily stood together at the foundation's opening ceremony. As applause filled the room, Callen looked at his smiling daughter and thought about how close he had come to losing hope. Sometimes the greatest miracles arrive disguised as the worst days of our lives. The humiliation in that cafe had ultimately revealed truth, compassion, and healing. It reminded everyone who heard the story that true greatness is not measured by wealth, power, or status. It is measured by kindness, when no one is watching, sacrifice when no reward is expected, and the courage to offer forgiveness when it is hardest to give. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that every person deserves to be seen not for their appearance or circumstances, but for the story hidden within their heart. Because one act of compassion can change a life, and one second chance can change many more.